Ooh, Kina is there.
Okay, we are at 2 o'clock. Welcome, everyone. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the Department of Art and Design's Fall 2022 Speaker Series. For those of you I haven't met, my name is April Dean. I'm the Gallery Manager in the Department of Art and Design. Before we jump in, I have an apology. Closed captioning is not connected on this Zoom account. Total blunder on my part. It's a brand new Zoom account and I wasn't able to get an e-class connection going. We will add captions when the recording becomes available on YouTube, but I'm very sorry if that creates a hurdle for anyone attending today. We will get it fixed before our next speaker event. As you know, this is our first talk in the Visual Art and Design Speaker Series. Today we're running from 2 until 2:45. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions after the talk. The talk is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the Art and Design YouTube channel. You should all be muted on your way in, and if you can stay that way while our presenters are speaking, that's really helpful. You can use the chat function if you have questions, and I will keep an eye on the chat. We will mostly wait on questions until the end. It's a great pleasure to acknowledge the land that we meet on today. Although we are in virtual space, the University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. I am delighted to introduce our speakers. So a warm welcome to Chris Reyns-Chikuma and Lindsey Sharman. Chris is a professor at the University of Alberta. He teaches courses in French on Francophone culture, in particular French comics, and in English on comics, especially superhero and graphic novels, as well as comparative literature. His research focuses on comics, and his recent publications are a book on French comics publishing house. I might brutalize this pronunciation. Is it Glénat?
Perfect.
Okay. A book co-edited with 2 colleagues entitled Brussels, 1900 Vienna, Networks in Literature, Visual and Performing Arts and Other Cultural Practices, and 2 articles on the influence of manga on Canadian comics and on drawn pictures in a Franco-Albertan newspaper. Chris is also one of the co-founders of the website on Beyond the Two Solitudes, and he regularly organizes small exhibitions on comics on campus, in public libraries, and in art galleries. Lindsey Sharman was born in the late 1900s and has been the curator of the Art Gallery of Alberta since 2018. She has studied art history and curating in Canada, England, Switzerland, and Austria, earning degrees from the University of Saskatchewan and the University of the Arts, Zurich. From 2012 to 2018, she was the first curator of the Founders Gallery at the Military Museums in Calgary, an academic appointment through the University of Calgary. Her primary area of interest is sensorial art experiences, and her latest obsession is olfactory art. Curatorial projects of note include Trench, a durational performance by Adrian Stimson, the nationally touring retrospective The Writing on the Wall, works by Dr. Joanne Cardinal Schubert, Liming, an exhibition by Curtis Santiago, and Roy G. Biv, and Sense of Movement, Sense of Place. Thank you so much, Lindsey and Chris, for opening our Art and Design Speakers Forum today. I am going to pass the microphone and the screen over to you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so we're here today to talk to you about our exhibition Comic Sans, or Comic Sans, if you would like to apply a French pronunciation to it. Yeah, so this is an exhibition that was originated by Chris. So he put together a proposal and presented it to the AGA, and our director was interested in doing a show about comics. The proposal was specifically to look at both French and English comics in Canada. And then Chris was then put in touch with me, and I was asked to work with him on this exhibition. And I am very thankful to Chris for all of his kind of extensive knowledge on Canadian comics, as well as, you know, just generally comics and comic practices internationally. It was, you know, the world of comics was something as an art curator that I wasn't totally initiated into. Of course, I had some knowledge of different artists who kind of straddle the worlds of comics and visual arts, like Walter Scott and Michael Nikolagalanis, who I had the opportunity to work with previously. But really, you know, Chris did kind of bring in this huge knowledge of comics into, you know, my kind of view of art, and really was excited to be able to dive into kind of the expansive world of comics. The show right now is up only until October 2nd. So you do just have a short little window left to be able to see it. And I hope that everybody joining us today will be able to come over to the AGA. And this is also your reminder that the AGA is always free to students with your student card. So you can always get in for free admission. So I guess we will just kind of get started here, and maybe I'll hand it over to you, Chris. You can give us a little intro.
Okay, so the title that we chose was Comic Sans in English, Comic Sans in French, and it's important because it was reflecting exactly what we wanted to have, a bilingual exhibition, meaning that in Canada, obviously, because the two official languages are French and English, we emphasized these two languages right away in the title, comic being an English word and sans means without in French, and being a French word, obviously, right? It's also because actually it was referring to a controversy in the 90s, I think the late 90s, about the name Comic Sans, which is connected to comics. So it made sense also to choose that title. And this refers to the fact that you have the script, right? I mean, and you can see on the screen how different it is with the serif or without it, right? And then it's the title meaning Comic Sans, meaning comic without. It's because we wanted to insist, to emphasize the constraints, without constraints. And this is where, I mean, we try to emphasize where comics could go beyond the book. So it's not that I mean, it's like neglecting the book, but it's like the connection between the book, which is the form that we know now about comics, right? Although it existed before in newspapers, for example, it wouldn't be book, but mostly what we know nowadays about comics is through books. And we wanted to show that it goes beyond the book, and so it's a book and beyond, right? And so that's what we did, selecting 12 artists, Canadian artists. And these 12 Canadian artists are actually coming from various traditions, not only linguistic traditions, but also, I mean, I would say cultural or national, right? So you have the French one, mostly influenced by the Franco-Belgian, so-called Franco-Belgian tradition, European tradition. And then you have the usually Canadian in English are heavily influenced by the American tradition of comics. And then you have other traditions that are often a bit more complicated. For example, the indigenous tradition that is much more recent, actually. It started to boom in the 90s, and sometimes in English, sometimes in French, and also, as we will see with Yagulanas, for example, sometimes trying to go beyond these two traditions, beyond Canada, and to, for example, pick up on the tradition of manga, for example. And this is, or this could be the fourth tradition, although not very present in our exhibition for several reasons, but is the manga tradition, which is not very powerful yet in the world of comics from the point of view of the artist, meaning you don't have a lot of artists yet, I mean, being influenced by manga. You have some, but not many proportionally. But as we know, I mean, manga is a huge phenomenon in the world of comics in terms of sales, for example, or fans in events like conventions, etc. So all this is present here in the exhibition in one way or another. Lindsey? Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, and I guess I was also, you know, one of the things that I was kind of interested in when we started doing research in this exhibition were kind of the more like formalistic constraints of comics, and thinking of comics sort of within the kind of constraints of like the individual comic panel in kind of a formalist sort of way, or the page, and really thinking of you know, works that really, you know, kind of go well beyond the page, and sort of are experimenting not only with the kind of grid of comics, but also, you know, with many other art forms as well. And then, you know, of course, we also wanted to kind of look a little bit at constraints of the industry. You know, comics are often dominated by men and dominated by white men, similar to, you know, trends in the art world as well. And so really wanting to kind of look a little bit more representationally at, you know, who is really working in this realm, and who can and who does make comics.
So comics was first taught as literature in literature departments in universities, or even in high school to some extent. So our perspective is not going to emphasize too much that aspect, meaning the narrative aspect. We emphasizing much more the design aspect, or the visual aspect, right? So that's a main difference. But we have to remember that unavoidably, even if we have, as you will see, I mean, one piece, visual piece on the wall, that piece is part of, I mean, a whole narrative. So you do have to consider, when you see the piece on the wall, for example, you do have to consider the narrative itself, but it's not the emphasis of the exhibition, right? So obviously also it's an artistic production, meaning that the drawing is important. I cannot really see what is written here, the page design, and things like that, right? So that's why it's obviously easier to talk about these aspects in a museum, because the narrative aspect is much more difficult to talk about I mean in a visual in a museum, right? Because it's a totally different aspect, right?
Mm-hmm. And so throughout the planning of this exhibition, one of the things that I was kind of always conscious of, and something that I was, you know, concerned about when we were putting together the exhibition, was that, you know, of course you are looking at and taking subject from books. And I think, you know, people's attention spans in the gallery are much different than the attention span that you might give to a work of art if you're sitting down, you know, on an afternoon to read a book. You know, your kind of interaction and the time that you're kind of dedicating to that is very different. And I think it's also, you know, kind of curatorially important that you keep in mind the entire exhibition, and that you have some sort of, you know, diversity in the types of media that you are presenting. And so one of the things that I really didn't want to do was to just have, you know, all framed hand-drawn pages on the wall, you know, something that could become, you know, like a little bit repetitive, and also sort of flattens the kind of artistic expression that's found in each of the artists. And so I was really interested in, you know, looking at artists who were not only working with a book format, but also were working in other ways, and were also interested in kind of translating their book work or published works in kind of different formats. And so that got us to this list of artists. And, you know, this is not an exhaustive list of mediums that are in the show. It was just something that, you know, we kind of like wanted to highlight out of each of them. And so, yes, we came to this group of artists in the end. And there's, you know, a balance of French and English, you know, different backgrounds and things like that as well.
And different medium, as Lindsey said. For example, the book itself is present also in the museum, but of course, murals, you have two, animation, you have two also, a connection with tie-ins, which is for comics very important, because in the world of comics, it's not often studied by scholars, but it's actually, from the fans' point of view, extremely important. I mean, buying figurines, right? I mean, these are plastic tie-ins or posters, etc., is very important. And some of the artists exposed there are actually kind of playing with that. These figurines, for example, instead of using plastic, they use ceramics, for example, and that's another type of material used in the exhibition, right? We have also tapestry, which is also very present in the exhibition, and it's the connection with comics is also very important there, because some people might say, and said actually, that comics go back to the tapestry of the Middle Ages, for example, or even beyond that. You have the famous tapestry of Bayeux in France, for example, which is extremely long, right? I mean, I think, if I remember, like 100 meters total. And so the tapestry is connected also to some extent to comics. And so we have several ones. Then we have neon sculptures. We have especially one case, and then posters and theater, where one comics was the adaptation of a play. So it's the reverse here. The first text is not the book, but the play. And the question was how to adapt a play into a book. So a three-dimensional play, obviously, to two-dimensional book, right? And then new technologies such as social media, for example, and craft, as we're going to talk about it more later.
All right, so now we have, several images of works in the exhibition, so you can kind of get a sense of the display and how everything was put together. Chris, do you want to talk about Anderson first?
With pleasure, yeah. So Anderson is the red one that you have on your right. And so this is, I mean, my wife, when she saw that, she said, but what's the connection with comics there? And obviously it's not direct, right? I mean, one more time, that's the point that I made before, that this is part of, it's a double page of a book. And it's we did that because the double page is a bleed, what we call a bleed, and a bleed is a technique in comics where the drawing and the colors are going beyond the frame of usually the panel, right? I mean, or even the whole frame of the page, and bleeds out, right? And so this is because this double page is actually following previous pages where you see that Martin Luther King is assassinated. The whole book is about that, the assassination of, or the life leading to the assassination of Martin Luther King, right? And so some pages before, you can see a red dot, and the red dot is becoming bigger and bigger in the following pages, and then it's becoming it's invading the whole page, if you want, and becoming a double page, fully, I mean, all red, right? And that's what we have that. And what we did is to blow up 20 times that double page. And obviously, it's also a reference to the fact that the artist, Anderson, is himself influenced by various arts, and for example, minimalist and maximalist arts, forms of art. And here it looks very much like an abstract art, right, to some extent. So we liked also that connection. And then you have also, you don't see it very well here, but you have 3 pieces of text in on the top left, in the middle, and in the bottom right, right? And the top left is a text about how the police is looking for the murderer of Martin Luther King. And in the middle, it's written, "Is it real, Daddy?" And then on the right, there is an allusion to "That's all, folks." Saying that's again, folks, instead of all, it says again, because again, the assassination, again, the death of a black guy, of a black person, etc. So that's how here we try to show the artistic part of that book.
Mm-hmm. And then on the left, we have Michael Nikolaioglanis. And so this is a mural that's constructed of the individual pages of his graphic novel. So his graphic novel or his comic, which he calls Haida manga, which is his term for the type of comics that he's doing, which is a combination of, imagery from his Haida culture, as well as kind of adopting different manga techniques. And so what you're seeing here is the kind of unbound book. So when you're reading the book itself, you would see just on the individual page these kind of swirling thick black lines, but you don't read them as an individual or as a specific image as you're sort of flipping through. You're only just reading the story of the comic. And then, it's not until you see the work kind of unbound and laid out like this that you would recognize that, each of those individual pieces is coming together to make this larger Haida design. And that there's an interesting aspect where, you kind of have this very uniform grid overlaid, this more kind of organic and swirling forms. So the artist kind of really thinks that, the mural is the primary way to interact with the work, that it should be the first thing that you consult when you're looking at the work. And the mural itself also doesn't have any text on it, whereas the actual publication itself does have, there are text bubbles where you have conversation between the different characters in the novel. And so his kind of, preferred way that people read it is to really, kind of study this work as a mural without that kind of descriptive text to it, and study it and sort of kind of, work on your own narrative of the story, and then kind of accepts that the narrative that the artist has put on it is not necessarily the only narrative that can be drawn out of it. Yeah, is there anything else you want to say about Ioglanis, Chris?
Maybe to add, well, 2 things quickly. I mean, the manga reference is interesting because it's not, for somebody knowing manga a little bit, I mean, it's not very obvious. It's probably as much an ideological point of view, meaning that he wanted to make a point, I mean, to try to criticize or to distance himself from the comics tradition, which is the American, and so from a indigenous point of view, it's an imperialist point of view, or a settlerist point of view, right? So he doesn't want to associate himself too much with the comics for, let's say the imperialist reason to some extent, right? So he found that it was interesting to say, okay, I'm more associated with the manga issue. Ironically, as we know, manga is Japanese, right? I mean, obviously Japan was also an imperialist nation, so it doesn't work completely, but at least he made a statement like that, and it's interesting in itself, right? And then you have maybe the second point quickly. I mean, it's the fact that you have 108 squares, small rectangles actually, to make the book, right? I mean, you can see these lines are straight and white, and then they contrast with the other way of dividing the murals here. And he also says that this is an opposition between the way of giving land to the settlers, for example, which was, made of rectangles, right? When they came here to for the settlers, they would draw pieces of land that would be usually rectangles, and so very rational, if you want, very mathematical to some extent, right? And of course, the opposite way is like the big thick lines that are absolutely not, straight, right? So you wanted that contrast also between the point of view of the settler and the point of view of the indigenous people, right?
Mm-hmm. And so there are, also 2 animations that we have in the exhibition. And, of course, there is a very strong connection artistically between, comic arts and animation. On the left, we have Pascal Blanchet, and on the right, Obam. For Pascal, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this animation, and there are several works in the exhibition that also kind of work with black and white and color. And so his use of black and white as kind of the main color scheme of the animation, but he is also kind of interspersing. There's a few scenes where everything is kind of in like pinky hues, and that shift of color also denotes a flashback. And so it's kind of giving you a visual cue that you're looking at a different time period when it comes to that part. And I think that there are a few other works in the exhibition where you have artists that are also, kind of playing with that, tradition of straight black and white line drawing comics that are kind of bringing in color to denote various things or draw attention in various ways. He's also working in a very, his style is often always in kind of like a mid-century sort of retro style. And it shows up in his comics as well, where, in the comics, you'll also have, there are often not the comic panels ever, but you'll have the image will be across the full double spread, or in each individual page. And so it's a kind of interesting play on that medium, and his work, the printed work, often has kind of like a poster sort of feel to it, where each page kind of is functioning as its own poster or as its own scene, and a kind of almost read a little bit like stills from an animation as well. Yeah, and then Chris, if you want to talk about Obam.
Yeah, Obam is a Quebecois artist. She works a lot for the ONF. I don't remember in English. The
NFB.
And okay, thank you. And then, but she also created a lot of some comic books. They're very easy to recognize because she uses a style that is very peculiar. First is minimalist, and then it's more like stick figures, right? I mean, characters that are drawn in a very simple way with they look almost like stick figures, right? And so this is one of her creations, and it tells the story of Caspar. That's the title also of the book first, and it was adapted into an animation a bit later. And the story is the story of inspired by a real story, actually, where in 1833, if I remember, a young teenager was found on a public space, public square, and he couldn't really talk. He had could say a couple of words, but not more than that. And people started to become very interested in that boy and trying to know where he was from, etc. And actually, it inspired a lot of artworks. I mean, for example, films, painting, and many other media, actually. And so this is so it was first a book by her with the same title, and then an animation. And the animation is slightly different from the book. The book is as most of her books in complete black and white. The animation uses some colors, although not many, and very soft. I mean, not very obvious, not very I mean, brilliant. Or so yeah, I think that's the story. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting in the adaptation between the comic and the animation is how Obam handles space. And in the, because this this child, Caspar, was, apparently confined alone to a room until he was, a teenager and hadn't interacted with other people, that in the comic version, all of the panels are very, very constrained, and there's kind of this, everything is made into these small spaces, whereas in the animation, oftentimes you have these scenes where the scene sort of grows and grows, and there's this real kind of interesting play between the animation and the comic of constricted space versus expansive space, which I think conceptually with the story is an interesting play that the artist is doing there. So here, this is Eminder Dhaliwal and Julie Delport. Both of these contributions, I think, are interesting in that they kind of take the comic world or the comic universe that these artists are creating and kind of expand it into the real world and draw these artifacts out of those universes that the artists have created. So on the left, with Eminder Dhaliwal, the comic that we kind of examined in the show is called Women World, and it's a sci-fi work where all of the men in the world have died out, and so you have only women left, and it's the women sort of trying to rebuild society and looking primarily at the relationships that are kind of built and maintained. And then in one of the scenes in the comic, you have the community coming together in sort of a town hall meeting where they decide that they need a flag that unites them. And so they have this, there's all of these ideas going around for different types of flags, and they decide that they need something that is, illustrative of, women's endurance and strength and beauty. And so they all decide on Beyonce's thighs as representative of that. And so this is the flag that they come up with in the comic, which is Beyonce's thighs flag. And then in the following pages of the comic, you also have a sort of map almost of different communities in the area where, it's one community has decided to unite under Beyonce's thighs, and the others, have decided to, under, Beyonce's elbow, or, all different kind of aspects of Beyonce that they all decide to unite under.
And the second one, so, is by Julie Delport. Julie Delport is actually was born in France, but she works in Quebec. She's been working there for at least 10 years. Her books are usually very connected to the outside world, as Lindsey mentioned before. I mean, for example, in this case, what you see here are tie-ins in ceramics, and they're all coming from the story. the story of the, I mean, in the book, right, that she tells in the book. And the story of the book is actually inspired by women who were abused in her large circle, neighborhood, friends, family, etc. And she first so had interviews with them, and then she put some sentences by these women outside on kind of billboards outside, and then she decided to use these sentences in a book and add some drawings and watercolor, mostly drawings. And then she made ceramics pieces that you can see here, and obviously this could be interpreted as a parody, as mocking to some extent, one more time, the comic world, because as you know, the comic world is, as Lindsey mentioned before, also a very white macho world. I mean, masculine, but even macho, if you think about the superheroes, for example, and it's a big debate in the comics world, right? And then obviously here she had the completely different and even opposite point of view, right? And then she uses, instead of a figurine of Batman or Superman, for example, she has these figurines that are in the stories that are very much ordinary to some extent, but are important in the story. And so it's a way to mock the world of fans to some extent, not in a mean way, but I mean to parody it, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Lindsey, it was you or me here?
I think it's you.
Okay, well, this is one of my favorite ones, actually, and it's also one of my favorite ones because I discovered it. I didn't know it. This is Lindsey. Lindsey introduced me to this artist, and I thought it was like amazing. So these are what you see here. You don't have the size, unfortunately. There's nobody in front of it to see. It's pretty big. So you see 8 panels. Made of carpet or texture or textile, right? The beginning of it is that she made a zine, a comic zine, right? I mean, and it's available on the left of, you don't see it here, but on the table on the left of the panels that you see there. And so the story of the zine is telling a story in about 100 panels. And of course, she couldn't make 100 panels out of this textile because everyone is taking about 40 hours. So she chose like 24. She made 24 and had a big exhibition in Chicago, and like 2 or 3 years ago, if I remember. And then we decided, in collaboration with her, to expose only some of them, just also because of the space we had, right? We couldn't expose anyway the 24. And so you see 8 of them there, and you can see how colorful it is. And the one on the right, for example, is a very clear reference to comic book with the panels, right? So you have panels in panels, even a mise en abîme, we could see. And there are plenty of references to comics, but also to painting. And this is also why it's interesting here, because by using textile to make a panel, which is within the frame where you see traditionally painting made of color, right? I mean, you have also an opposition between the craft and meaning the low art and the high art, right? So you also have a criticism here of the world of art, where, as we mentioned at the beginning, I mean, it's still very much dominated by males, and so where usually the craft is something considered as a low art, if it's an art, until certainly recently, and actually in museum most of the time. It's still the case to some extent, and so it's a way to contest that hierarchy, right? So I don't know if you want to add something, Lindsey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is the one comic artist that I introduced Chris to. The rest of them he introduced me to. Yeah, I will also say that the the story is a combination of the artist's life with the life of Emily Carr. And so Jessica Campbell grew up in Victoria, 100 years later than Emily Carr, but only about 15 minutes away from each other. And so she's been really influenced by the writings of Emily Carr's journals, and also, that the subjects of a lot of her work are places where Jessica Campbell grew up. And so the zine that this work comes from is this kind of blending of Emily Carr's life with Jessica Campbell's youth. And so in this grouping in particular, if you're looking at it in two lines, the first two are representations of Emily Carr, and then the last one is also a representation of Emily Carr, and the rest are Jessica Campbell, but they're meant to be sort of mixed together. And so she's also really interested in this idea of kind of blending narrative. This one is to show the image or the work that's on the left, so the neon. It is not a good image to represent that work. It doesn't photograph very well, but I did want to share this image because it does give you a little bit of a sense of the actual installation and the layout of the exhibition. And so this neon work that you see on the left of the image here is by Walter Scott. So Walter Scott, probably best known for his series of Wendy comics, which are, kind of satirizing and poking fun at all the various aspects of the art world, primarily looking at art school and masters and working in a gallery and things like that. And so one of the things that one of the themes that kind of is continually comes up in Walter Scott's work is this sort of tension or discomfort with being both the artist and the subject of your work. And so his work is autobiographical. And so, he talks a lot about this double anxiety of, the anxiety of showing work, but then also the kind of added anxiety of showing work that's about yourself. And so what the actual neon is, it switches back and forth between the two, and on the outside of the box you have this smiling face, and there's two hands sort of holding up the box, and then in the box you have this screaming face and the hands are sort of pushing out. So you have this image of this kind of trapped person screaming inside the box, and then the sort of artist kind of smiling and holding up their work.
So you have also like an image of a puppeteer and a puppet, for example, where one is manipulating the other one, and so the anxiety is also, agency to some extent, but depending on the point of view, of course, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, here on the left you have Rabaliati. So Rabaliati is like one really probably the most famous artist of comic books, of bande dessinée in Quebec and beyond. It's kind of representing the typical example of the traditional bande dessinée. So we have on the left, meaning it's as you can see, it's a corner here, and on the left you have 4 panels coming from a story in French called Paul à Québec, so Paul in Quebec, right, in Quebec City, right? And the 4 pictures that we chose are taking place in a cemetery. And so the whole atmosphere is pretty sad to some extent, right? It's all black and white, which is the way he does all his comic stories. And funnily enough, it's the translation of comic, this bande dessinée is actually the Song of Roland. And it's called the Song of Roland because that's the book is telling the story of Roland, who is dying So it's kind of his last song, kind of the swan song, right? I mean, and so on the right, the piece of art there was made like about 10 years later, and he was asked to use his character Paul, and it's called Paul in Montreal, and he was asked to do that to celebrate the 375th anniversary of the foundation of Montreal. So you have the contrast, very obvious right away, right, between on the left only black and white, and it's an event, but it's a sad event in many ways, right? And on the right you have the opposite, where it's a celebratory event with colors and positive, obviously, because it's a celebration, right? And what is interesting on the right is that, I mean, on the left we had to blow up the pictures, right? It's much smaller, right? It's just small, I mean, the size of a comic book, right? Of a roman graphique, a graphic novel, right? On the right, these are the one on the top and on the bottom are actually the real size of big panels, big posters, billboards that he used that they put in the city, and you had to go through an itinerary to go from one famous monument building in the history of Montreal. And so you have the story of this character, the beginning, Paul, who is in the date is like 1640 something. I don't remember precisely the date, but the foundation of Montreal, sorry. And a woman is passing by, and then she loses her, it could be an apron, and obviously you see that in red, right? And the whole story is then told in 12 panels, where he is running after her to try to give her back the apron. But as you can see, what we decided is we didn't have a space for the 12th real size panels. So what we did is to reduce the panels 2 to 11 to a size that were much smaller, right? And it tells every step is a different period in the history of Montreal, and at the same time a different place in the history of Montreal. So you really have a history of Montreal, but through space and time, right?
Do you want to talk about Jourdan also?
You only, okay, yeah. I mean, I already mentioned Jourdan. Actually, is what you can see on the right is posters also that are. This is a piece, a fragment of a page in the graphic novel by Jourdan. So Jourdan isn't produced much. Is in terms of comic graphic novels. He's more famous as an artist making posters in Montreal, posters of famous singers or pop celebrities, right? And he was approached by Lepage, who is a very famous playwright in Montreal, in much beyond in Montreal, internationally famous. And Lepage created a play. As I said, it's three-dimensional, and he had to adapt it into a graphic novel, which is two-dimensional. What is interesting, quickly to say about that, is that the play itself is playing with the dimensions, the three or two dimensions. It's quite difficult to explain very quickly, but so it's already that issue is already present in the play, and he's trying to adapt it to the comic book, to the graphic novel. And the graphic novel is taking place in China, and there are three characters. A Québécois who decided to go to China to open a gallery, an art gallery, and that's what you see here. The posters are part of the exhibition in the gallery. And then he has a girlfriend who is a Chinese artist, and she's struggling with modernity. She's trying to find her way between traditional China and modern China and in her art. And these are paintings that she's supposed to have created or that she has created in the story. And then there's a third character, but I don't want to talk too much about that because it takes too much time. So yeah.
Thank you. Right, so just to finish up, I'll introduce Marta Kudolinska. So Marta was born in Poland, but came to Canada quite young. And so a lot of her work is looking at kind of forging a connection with that Polish heritage that she did not grow up in. And so in the exhibition, there's two works of hers. So one comes from a series of lino cuts that she's done and created into a wordless novel. So it's all lino cuts, and there's no dialogue and there's no text in the whole novel. And then there's this piece here that kind of tells the dual annotated history of Poland, as well as her own kind of familial history. And then in the center in this one, you have this straw sculpture. And so this is something that historically would have been made in, many kind of village homes, and is also something that, people sometimes make, around like holiday times to decorate their homes as like Christmas decorations and things like that. And so, she's really interested in things that are made by hand, hence her interest in lino cuts, as well as, kind of working with these more traditional like straw sculptures as well. And I think it's also, this sort of idea of, craft in air quotes, as kind of Chris was introducing a little bit with Jessica Campbell's work, that you do have a few artists who are kind of drawing on these sort of craft traditions in the show with, the ceramic works and the textile works, and as well as this one, which, includes the straw sculpture in the center, but also cut out paper that are made into kind of like 3D relief in the other panels in the work. So yeah, just being a little bit mindful of time, I'll just kind of wrap it up there. Does anybody have any questions for us, maybe?
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I will maybe just stop the recording, and then if folks want to audibly ask questions, that might be a bit more comfortable for them, but you're also welcome to drop things into the chat. I see Sean is